I was about 9 years old, I lived with my mother and younger sister in a small house in a quiet town. The streets were mostly safe, and the kids rode their bikes outside in the summer. But even then, there were things I didn't like about the house. My mother would say it was old, and old houses make noise. But some of the things I remember from that time didn't sound like house noises. They sounded like something else. Something I still don't know how to explain. The first thing started one night when I couldn't sleep. I was lying in my bed with a blanket pulled up to my chin, staring at the little stars that were twinkling in the dark on my ceiling. My room wasn't very big, just a bed, a dressing room, and a toy box by the window. I remember looking at the shadows on the wall of the trees outside. The branches swayed in the wind, and I told myself that was what I was seeing. But then I noticed one shadow wasn't moving like the others. It was in the corner by my toy chest. At first, I thought it was a pile of clothes or one of my big stuffed animals. I almost laughed at myself because I thought I was just a creepy kid, but then I blinked and the shadow was gone. I remember feeling cold, like it was not air but a cold coming from inside my body. I pulled the blanket over my head and fell asleep. The next morning, I didn't think about it until I saw my toy chest. It was open as if someone was looking inside. I never left it open because my mother would scream when the toys came out. I closed it and didn't say anything. A few weeks later, my sister, who was only 5 years old, told my mother that she didn't like the man in the closet. I basically froze when she said it because she said it so easily, as if it was just a fact. My mother shrugged it off and said, "Little kids imagine things." But I could see from my sister's face that she wasn't making it up. She said she would stand in the closet and whisper at night, but she couldn't hear the sound. My mother had talked to her that night and prayed with her, but she hadn't checked the closet. Later that night, I woke up to something dragging on my floor, like someone pulling nails on wood. I was so scared, but the sound stopped right next to my bed. I was sure if I looked over, I would see something staring at me. I just lay there, holding onto the blanket, and fell back asleep. The next morning, there were long scratches on the floor right next to my bed. They were fresh, like someone had carved them into the wood. I remember running to show my mother, but she got angry. She said I must have been playing with something sharp or pulling on furniture. I swore I hadn't done it, but she didn't believe me. After that, the night got worse. I heard a soft whisper, almost like a radio on low volume, and it was coming from my closet. Sometimes my sister would cry in her room, and when I would run in, she would point to the corner and say, "He's there. He's there." I had never seen him, but I believed him. You know when someone is watching you and the hairs on your arms stand up? That's what it felt like. The scariest night was in the middle of winter. I woke up to find my bedroom door open, even though I always kept it closed. I could see the light in the hallway because my mother had left one for us at night. But then when I looked, the light in the hall had gone out. I thought maybe the bulb had gone out. Then I heard footsteps coming down the hall. They stopped outside my door. I wanted to scream for my mother, but nothing came out. The door creaked and I saw a tall, dark figure leaning in, only its head poking out of the room. I closed my eyes and pretended to be asleep. When I opened the door again, it was closed and I was alone. In the morning, I asked my mother if he had come into my room. She said no. He had been asleep all night. My sister said that she had seen the man standing by her bed again. We told my mother together, and finally she looked worried. She lit a candle and prayed in every room of the house. After that, everything was quiet for a while, but it didn't last. One afternoon, I got home from school before my mother. I was sitting on the couch doing homework when I heard the sound of my toy box being closed. The thing is, no one else was home. I thought it was just the wind, but when I went down the hall, I saw my bedroom door open. My toy box was closed, but all my toys were scattered on the floor as if someone had thrown them out. I stepped back and waited outside until my mother came home. When I told her, she still didn't believe me and said that the cat had torn things up. Years later, after we had left home, I asked my mother if she had ever felt anything in that house. She hesitated, then said yes. She said that sometimes she would wake up and see a shadow standing at her door. She said she never told us because she didn't want to scare us, but she admitted that she believed there was something wrong with the house. She said she thought it was a man, someone who had lived there before. She didn't say much, but I know what I saw, and so did my sister. Now, as an adult, when I think about that time, I feel sick to my stomach. It wasn't a fantasy. It was real, and it wanted us to know it was there. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I can still hear the sound of nails being driven into the floor. Music. When I was 10, my family moved to a bigger house because my mother had just remarried and we needed more space. The house was beautiful, newer than the one we had lived in before, and it was in a quiet neighborhood with lots of trees. I thought I would be happy there. At first, everything seemed normal, but then little things started happening that made me think the house wasn't right. My bedroom was at the end of the hall. It had 2 large windows facing the back and a closet that was deeper than my previous window. It was my favorite until the first night I slept there. I woke up in the middle of the night because I heard some movement in the closet. It wasn't loud, just a gentle movement like a clothes being swept. I looked at the closet and told myself it was just the house settling down. I know it sounds cliche, but most people, even as children, assume that the little noises coming from back and forth in the house are just normal household noises that you hear every day. But then I saw the door move. It didn't open, but it shook as if someone had lightly pushed it from the inside. I wanted to run to my mother's room, but I froze. I stood there like that, still staring at the closet, until I fell back asleep. The next morning, the closet door was a little ajar, even though I had closed it tightly. I asked my mother if he had been in there, and she said no. She said maybe the air vents had knocked, but I knew it wasn't an air vent. The nights that followed got worse. I heard a tapping sound on the window pane. At first I thought it was a tree branch, but when I looked, there were no branches near the window. The tapping continued for a few minutes, and when I pulled the blanket over my head, it stopped. I tried to ignore it until one night I finally peeked out. I saw a pale hand pressing against the window. It was outside, but the window was on the 2nd floor, inaccessible except by stairs. The hand was there for a long time, just pressing without moving. Then it slowly lowered and disappeared. I couldn't sleep that night. I told my mother, and when I told her, she started laughing. She didn't believe me for a second. When he saw that I wasn't just saying it as a joke, he tried even harder to convince me that I was probably half asleep and seeing things in my dreams. But I knew it was a hoax. My stepfather didn't believe me either. He said I was making it up to get attention, and he laughed at that too. But I started to notice that he kept the hallway light on at night. So maybe he didn't feel safe pretending. A month later, my little brother, who was 4 years old, started talking about the white woman. He would say that she came into his room and sat on his bed. My mother thought it was just his imagination. But one night, I heard her scream. I ran inside and found her curled up under her blanket, crying. When she finally calmed down, she said that the white woman was standing by her door, just looking at her. She said her eyes were black. I believed her because of what I saw in my window. I started sleeping with a blanket over my head every night. But that didn't stop the dreams. I started dreaming of the white woman too. She would stand in the corner of my room and whisper my name. Her voice was dry, like the sheets rubbing together. Sometimes I would wake up and still hear it, faint, but definitely real. One night, I woke up to find her standing at the foot of my bed. She was taller than anyone I had ever seen. Her head almost touched the ceiling. She was wearing a long white dress that moved even in the still wind. Her hair was black and stringy, and her face was as pale as chalk. Her eyes were empty black holes. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them again, she was gone. But my closet door was open. After that, I couldn't go to my closet anymore. I begged my mother to let me sleep in her room, but she said I should learn to be brave. I don't think she wanted to admit that she was scared either. The worst night came during a storm. heavy rain and strong winds. I woke up to the sound of my window creaking. When I looked, the window was slowly opening. Even though it was locked, I could see the lock turning on its own. The window opened all the way and I saw the white woman crawling in. She wasn't moving like a human. She was floating. Her feet never touched the floor. She leaned over my bed and leaned in until she was right in front of my face. I felt her cold breath on my skin. She whispered my name again, and this time I screamed as loud as I could. My mother and stepfather ran in, but when they turned on the light, the window was closed and locked, and no one else was there. They yelled at me to scare everyone, but I could see in their faces that they were worried. The strange thing about that part of the story is that I can't remember exactly what happened between seeing the woman floating towards me and me screaming. The best I can explain is that I was plunged into darkness for a moment and I remember my parents screaming into the house. My window was closed again, which people would have thought was just a night terror. That's what my parents believed. I think my mother started taking me to therapy for a while because they were worried about me. We lived in that house for another 3 years and I just couldn't get used to it anymore. My brother stopped talking about the white woman, but I think it was because he was so scared, because he stopped coming. Sometimes I would hear him crying at night, saying, "Go away." I think he didn't want to be forced to go to therapy either. Sometimes when there's a storm at night, I'm still afraid to go to the bathroom or get up to get water. I look in the corner of the room, make sure there's something long hidden there. It shows how these kinds of things stick with you into adulthood. I would have been more open to believing it was just a night terror if my little brother had seen that hand in my window before he said the white woman thing. I think it's one of those weird experiences that can't be explained. Music. When I was 8, I used to ride my bike every day after school. We lived on quiet streets with small houses and big trees. I understood every crack in the sidewalk. I knew where the postman stopped. There was a house I liked down the block. I had to drive to the corner of the block to see the yard. There was a long driveway and a wide lawn. An old man would stand in that driveway most afternoons. He always wore a hat and would stand where the driveway met the sidewalk and look out at the street. When I rode by, he would say hi. He never came out onto the sidewalk. He never got out of his driveway. He would call and wave and then go back to his yard. I always waved. My mom never told me to cross the street alone, so I never crossed the street to talk to the guy face to face. And the guy knew it. He would call me from his place and ask about school. He would ask about my bike. He would ask if I liked the bell on my new red bike. I remember one time he told me a joke about a cat that made me laugh. We talked like that for a few weeks. The conversations were small. They were always from this driveway to the curb. It was like he knew little things about me without me saying anything. For example, I had a little brother or my dad had bought a new car. I never told him any of these things. I thought maybe he saw us from down the street or something, like he was just a neighbor keeping an eye on the road. One day, I bought a new bike. It was red and had a shiny bell, like I said before. I slowly rode down the block and he yelled, "Nice bike." He asked if I wanted to run around the corner. I told him no because my mom would get mad. He laughed and said, "One day." After that, we talked about small things. He told me about a bird that liked his fence and then about the rule of not stepping on a certain rock. Then he told me a story about a dog that always brought back a shoe. He sounded like someone who had time to notice small things. I started looking for him when I rode my bike. Sometimes in the afternoon he would be there, sometimes he wouldn't. Then for a week he would stop coming out. I would drive down the block by the house, but no one would be there. The curtains on the front window were closed. I slowed down and looked down the driveway, wondering how strange it was not to see the guy. I wanted to ask my mom if I could cross the street. She said no. She said the street wasn't for unsupervised children. Anyway, after a few days, I saw a woman in the yard of that house. I had never seen anyone in that yard before. I had to drive around the corner to see her. Her hair was tied back and she was holding a watering can, so I had to assume she was watering the flowers there. I stopped my bike in the street so she wouldn't see me too close. I wanted to call across the street like I always do, but I couldn't. I don't know if I was too shy or afraid of what my mother would say if I stayed out too late. Although I noticed, the woman didn't notice me as much. A few days later, I drove by again, and the woman was on the back porch. She had a mug in her hand. I sat on my bike and watched for a while. Then she opened a small side door and walked around the house. I slowly pedaled around the corner and waited where the sidewalk curved. I looked down the block to make sure my mother wasn't outside. Then I decided I would quickly cross the street. I pedaled through as if my life depended on it. The house looked big up close. The driveway was long and sloped down to the street. I felt like I wasn't allowed to be there. I stopped at the end of the driveway near the back gate. The woman heard me. She turned and saw a little boy standing at the gate with a red bicycle. She was surprised but not angry. She got to the gate and opened the door and asked what I was doing there. I told her about the man in the driveway and that he would say hi as I rode by. I told her that she knew my name and that she said she would race me one day. She wiped her hands on her dress as if she was working and then said that the man I had described sounded like her husband. I laughed, thinking she would say he had gone on a trip or that he was inside and she would go get him, but she didn't laugh. She said that he had died last year. She said that he had died in his chair. His name was Harold. I felt a cold place open in my chest. I asked her if she had a picture of him. I wanted to see him. She went inside and came back with a small frame. The picture showed a man wearing the same hat and the same wide smile. He actually resembled the man I had always seen. Then the woman said that the picture was new, taken only a few years ago. She said that her husband had had a scar on his cheek since he was a child. I looked at the picture closely and the man in the picture had a thin, pale scar from his ear to his mouth. I remembered the man in the driveway. He had no scars. He had a round, simple face and smooth skin. The hat matched and the smile matched, but the scar didn't. I told her that I had seen a scar on the man's face once, but I thought he had rubbed his cheek once. She said that the scar had been there for a long time, but sometimes he would hide it under the straw. She said again that her husband had died and that no one else lived in the house. He said that he had come back last summer to tend to the garden and that he had never seen or heard anyone standing in the driveway. To be honest, at this point I was starting to get a little scared. I thanked him and walked down the driveway. I didn't look back at the yard. I slowly walked back home and put my bike in the garage. The ride was like turning off the radio and driving the rest of the way home after a car accident. When I got home, my mom didn't ask any questions. She just told me to be careful. That night, I couldn't sleep. I thought about the man in the hat. I thought about his smile and the way he said my name. And I thought about the stains in the picture. The next day, I walked by the house and the curtains were open. The sunlight touched the porch and the driveway, but no one was standing in the driveway. I waved from the corner, but no one backed away, so I pedaled on. For a while, nothing else happened. I tried to forget. I made new routes on my bike. I talked to kids on other blocks. Weeks passed. Then one night, I woke up and heard my name. It felt like someone was outside my window. The voice was familiar. It said my name just as the man across the street used to say it. I quickly sat up and my head started spinning. The light sound of raindrops outside. I realized that I was hearing my name being called over and over again. I shouted to my mother and then threw the blanket over myself and hid. She hurried inside and sat next to the bed. I told her about the voice outside my window. She rubbed my back and said that the wind was blowing. To make me feel better, she went to the window and pulled up the curtains. She said that there was no one outside, so I went to check myself. It was raining lightly outside, but outside, my mother was right. Dad got up and checked the windows and door locks. He looked outside with a flashlight, which made me feel better. They said that there was no one outside. When I insisted that I heard a voice, they said, perhaps the most common thing a parent would tell a frightened child, that I had dreamed it. The next morning, my throat was sore from screaming the night before. I told my friends at school, and they laughed at me because they were implying that I believed in ghosts. A friend dared me to stand in the driveway of that house at night and call out her name. I didn't dare. Days passed and nothing happened, so I left. Years passed and the streets changed. Houses sold and the woman's house sat empty for a while. I once saw movers unpacking boxes. Later, new people were painting the front. The long driveway was still there, but there were new cars. I drove by and didn't look for a man in a hat. I grew up. I learned other ways. I learned the names of new neighbors and their dogs. And finally, at 18, I left for college. I never went back to that house because my parents sold it when I was in college. But the memory of that man sits like a small rock in my chest. I wonder why I didn't ask the woman for more pictures or press her for more details. I think at that moment I was scared to think I was talking to a ghost. I didn't cross that street again for a long time. Later in life I told the story to one or two people and they even asked why I didn't go back and ask the woman more or why I didn't tell the woman what I remembered. Maybe they were right. Maybe I should have been braver. Maybe I should have asked more about that scar, or to look at the wedding pictures, but I was 8 years old. I didn't really think that way. A few years ago, I was driving down the street, and there was only one boy riding a bicycle. The street was empty. I wanted to stop for a moment. I wanted to know if anyone was standing there and saying hi. I wanted to know if anyone had heard any noise in the rain. I wanted a small answer that would bridge the gap. But I didn't stop. I just kept driving. The memory remained as it was, and these days I try my best to suppress it.